And I said last week, geez, could the government get away without giving the tax cuts it promised? It's kind of primed the pump with all these fiscal holes and how bad Labor was. And I asked the question on social media and a few people over the weekend, did you vote for National because of tax cuts or not? The other thing that's going on is the impact that e-commerce, and we heard from Retail New Zealand this morning saying online shopping has made retail really hard in New Zealand. And there's been a massive debate going on about Uber and Uber's industrial relations with its drivers and the competition that Uber has obviously given to taxi industries. And it seems to me all these things in some ways interrelate. And a guy who can often make sense out of things that just make my brain hurt is Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative. He joins us now. Eric, how are you? Good to see you.
Doing well. Just got over COVID. It's great to be back at the office.
Oh, okay. All right. And you're not zooming it in. Bloody good on you. Look, first, I just want to ask about tax. We had Chris Hipkins basically saying everything's back on the table for Labor for tax. And I don't know, I think we've got a national government that said it would give us tax relief, so feels a moral obligation to. But I also think we've got an electorate that isn't exactly gagging for tax cuts if they're going to be inflationary. Let's deal with the tax thing first. What do you think the current government should do?
Should remember that the only real long-term tax cut is a spending cut. Because if you're just reducing the amount of tax that government is collecting today without reducing government spending, you are just increasing future tax burdens. So if they can't see fit to get spending back down from, I wouldn't say record high levels, because decades ago they were higher than they are now, but certainly outside of recent experience. If you look back to when National left office, government spending was a much smaller fraction of the economy. If you look to what Ardern had set in the well-being budget in 2019, there she was projecting that, or well, rather, Treasury was projecting that Labor's set of policy initiatives from 2019 in the big well-being budget would, over the medium term, not cost the economy more than 29% of GDP. So for every $100 of economic activity, a little less than 29 was going to be government, core government activity. And we're well north of 33% now. If National cannot bring that down, and revenues are coming up to about 30%, so core tax revenue it's inching up towards 30%, which is higher than it had been. It had been a little south of 29%, and under Ardern's plan had been on track for rising to about 30, staying in line with their spend. National has to be willing to get spending down. If they're not, then it's a mistake to cut current taxes, because all you're doing is pushing that tax burden out to the future.
Okay, and it's inflationary, a tax cut, essentially?
Well, if government is spending more than it's taking in, it's adding to that pressure, and the Reserve Bank has been working against that kind of pressure for some time. Inflation rates have been coming down, but the Reserve Bank will not have room to get interest rates back down again until inflation is back in line. In Canada, it's getting back to around the 2% midpoint. New Zealand is nowhere close to that. We're still well north of the top of the upper bound rather than looking towards the midpoint of it. We're heading into a bit of an economic slowdown, so fiscal stimulus would not be as inflationary in that environment. But man, the Reserve Bank is still trying to fight inflation.
All right. So you think, and I guess we talk here in the abstract and the figures, which is slightly separated from the politics of the situation. Do you think the current government could be forgiven for delaying tax relief and tax cuts and would have a justified reason to say why?
Possibly, but the real problem is they're not being ambitious enough in getting spending down to pre-crisis levels. So one thing that really worries me in all of this is that there was really broad cross-party, cross-sector agreement that government needed to have the flexibility to deal with COVID as it came. So in March 2020 through May 2020, everyone said, okay, government should be able to issue as much debt as is needed to get this job done. This is the rainy day that everybody's been waiting for. Instead, it's looked like it's turned into a whole pile of locked-in structural spend. And if that winds up being how we deal with crises, then there will be an awful lot less agreement.
This is so interesting because Chris Hipkins just talked about the apprenticeship program and even school lunches and said those were all COVID measures. You know, and we hadn't funded them out, but they were so good we were going to keep them. Exactly the sort of mission creep that you're describing. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So do not expect widespread agreement on government getting flexibility in the next crisis, and that will be to the detriment of the next crisis response, but it'd be for the long-term good of the country if we cannot get governments that will treat a crisis as a crisis and then retrench afterwards.
Right, and we haven't done the retrench afterwards. We kept living on the never. Just quickly, his speech.
Well, Labour certainly did.
Yeah. God, the last thing we need is another Labour working group on capital gains tax, isn't it? We don't want to dance that dance again.
Well, it has been well canvassed.
Yeah.
It's been well canvassed by lots of different tax working groups. Some tax experts say that there might be some minor gains from getting it. It's less on the revenue raising side and more on tax system integrity and coherence. Other tax experts say, well, yeah, except we've had 4 decades of a tax system that has evolved around the absence of a capital gains tax. And that means that a whole pile of things that in other tax systems would be treated as a capital gains on a lower tax rate is here treated as ordinary income on your marginal tax rate. So you can't just bolt a capital gains tax onto a system that's evolved for 40 years around the absence of a capital gains tax,
right?
Nor should you expect great big revenue gains from it because you'll have a whole pile of other bits that get reclassified.
Yeah, but up the workers, Eric. Look, let's move on to the e-commerce thing and looking at a number of stories happening. We've got this Uber versus its drivers argument going on in employment relations. We have mainstream media in New Zealand saying we are dying because of Facebook and Google and online advertising, which is destroying our business. And we've got retailers this morning staying the same. Has any country in the world looked, or how are other places dealing with the negative economic impacts of e-commerce as a whole? And it's a really fast-moving issue, isn't it?
Well, it depends whether you want to view this as negative impacts, right? Because if e-commerce sites are out competing brick and mortar, that's giving consumers something that they previously wanted and had unfulfilled, right?
Yeah.
So if people had previously wanted easy delivery to home rather than having to go out shopping at shops, and now they're able to do that, consumers are better off for it. To the extent that governments try to hinder that, well, maybe they're doing well for existing incumbents, but they're hindering dynamism and they're hurting consumers. So I wouldn't count it as a good thing if legislation is coming into that mix and blocking stuff. One reason that Europe seems to be underperforming relative to the US is that the US has been allowing and enabling a lot more of this dynamism, where European legislation seems more attuned to protecting competitors against competition rather than enabling competition to deliver benefits for consumers. One worrying bit in the US is that the FTC has been pushing more in a European direction.
Okay, so it is an issue confronting economies, societies around the world, Eric.
Well, sure. Technological change hits everybody, and either you try and block it and stop it or slow it down, or you enable it and try and find some ways of making it easier for those who are displaced to find work in other industries. But these shocks are just going to keep coming, right? If you try and protect each set of incumbents against the effects of each of them, pretty soon you're back into a pre-84 New Zealand economy where everything is regulated, prices are all controlled, and everything's done by government edict.
Yeah, and it goes back to that great Henry Ford quote, if I'd given people what they wanted, I would have bred a faster horse. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that rate of change now is now incredibly fast, isn't it? And I look at this industry, the media industry I'm in, and it seems incumbent players are going to the government and going to Melissa Lee saying, oh, for God's sake, can you tax the people that are changing our business?
Well, it's a mistake, right? Because if you wanted to do that, then you'd go after Trade Me, right? Because they were the first ones that started disrupting it in New Zealand. For a while, they were owned by one of the media companies, but the loss of the classified ads is what really started breaking things because
good point.
Your previous equilibrium was, well, the fundamental underlying problem is that there's not all that much demand for real news. People get it as quasi-entertainment. You've got some weirdos that are really into it and are willing to pay for it, but there's a small number. It used to be that people would buy the newspaper to get the classified ads because that's where you would see things that you could buy and sell, read the sports, and a little bit of the rest of the headlines.
And the cartoons. Do not forget the cartoons and the crosswords.
Yeah, and the Sudoku, right? So once you're in a world where you can't cross-subsidize that anymore because there are lots of different players that each specialize in the niche that consumers actually want, well, then that golden age is gone, right? And you're not going to be able to rebuild it just by trying to tax some of the companies that have done well on other bits of the disintermediation.
Yeah. Hey, look, just coming back to kind of where we started, do you think Labor is capable of coming up with a decent tax policy that's different than Nationals?
It wouldn't be crazy for them to come up with a capital gains tax. Again, tax experts argue the toss on this one. It's not a clear cut, this is awesome or this is terrible. It's a kind of a line call that the usual response from tax experts is that you could have a capital gains tax that would be coherent and would be beneficial, but it's not the one that would ever be implemented by any sitting government because you'd wind up having to also tax the family home, and that seems to be
and that's your sticking point. Absolutely. Hey, Eric, thank you. I don't know if we've solved the problems of the world, but I see them a little more clearly every time I speak to you.
Happy to help.
Thank you. That is Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative. We covered a bit of ground there too, and I wanted to contextualise a few other things we've been talking about on the program and that we're going to talk about in the weeks ahead.